Paladins is one of those games that didn't necessarily escape my attention, but for years now has been a game that never entirely conformed to my personal playstyle preferences. Paladins had the misfortune, like many other notable games in the past, of releasing within the same time window as another, far more anticipated title, in this case being Overwatch. And ever since then, Paladins has continued to struggle with the PR problem of being perceived by many potential players as being merely a free-to-play alternative to Overwatch, when in reality this is pretty far from the truth. Now I won't deny that it is pretty clear that Paladins did actively clone certain features from Overwatch, like when the Paladins developers implemented a new play of the game-esque feature that proved to be almost identical in design to the one popularized by Overwatch. And some of the Paladins hero characters do pose a rather striking resemblance to certain Overwatch heroes. But I'm willing to let bygones be bygones on that front because the surface level stuff is really all these two games strongly share in common. I could have easily put out a video years ago critiquing Paladins, but for one reason or another, it just never felt like the opportune moment. Well, now 4 years later, I guess now is the time, now that the game's pool of playable characters is greater than the total number of US presidents. Before we go any farther, I will readily admit it's been a while since I've really tried playing Paladins for any meaningful length of time, so don't expect much in the way of exciting pro-level gameplay. As someone who mainly plays tank, defense, and support characters like Pyro and Engineer from TF2, and Reinhardt, Lucio, Mercy, and Moira in Overwatch, and primarily IO here in Paladins, I've somewhat trained myself to focus more on positioning, cooldown management, and team communication, rather than raw damage output or kill-death ratios. That said, let's continue. Paladins, for those relatively unfamiliar with it, is a free-to-play, team-based hero shooter, which differentiates itself from its competition by strongly emphasizing a more MOBA-esque gameplay design formula. All heroes are divided into 4 distinct roles: frontliners, supports, flankers, and damage dealers. Frontliners in Paladins, as in Overwatch and other hero shooters, are effectively the quarterbackers of the team. Frontliners generally either have a shield or some kind of barrier to protect their team, or they rely on their massive health pool and immense physical bulk to draw enemy fire. Sometimes both. Frontliners are great for, well, holding the front line, such as when capturing or defending a control point or guarding a payload. The trade-off, though, lies in their rather limited mobility compared to other character types. Damage dealers, as the name might imply, are generally smaller heroes with a more limited amount of health, but with increased mobility compared to the frontliners. Damage dealers specialize in being able to quickly traverse the battlefield, stun and kill enemies, either by dealing long-range damage from behind the safety of a frontliner, or by flanking around and getting behind enemy lines in order to potentially catch enemies by surprise, and as a result deal rather devastating damage. Then you have supports, my personal specialty. While being a support character might not sound super appealing at first, don't make the mistake of underestimating the incredibly diverse character abilities and card loadouts at the disposal of any support character. In many situations, a support character can just as easily prove deadly to enemies as they are beneficial to your team. Unlike Overwatch, where some characters, yes, I'm specifically looking at you, Mercy, are entirely dependent on their team to deal damage for them, all supports in Paladins are quite capable of fulfilling more than one role at a time. Now that we've covered the 4 basic roles, let's dive headfirst into some more of the complicated bits. In general, I think there's one pretty universal fair bit of criticism worth levying against Paladins, and that's the game is simply too damn complicated for casual play. There's a reason why Overwatch is more dominant across the world than Paladins is. In fact, there's a handful of reasons, but arguably the 2 most relevant ones to this discussion are, number 1, that Overwatch is simply easier to learn and to an extent easier to master. And number 2, Paladins doesn't necessarily incentivize individual play but rather team play. Before you get angry with me for daring to criticize Overwatch, because God forbid I do so, understand that I'm speaking as someone who has more hours in Overwatch than is healthy, especially when it comes to competitive mode, which I've been playing since Season 2. So trust me, I know what I'm talking about here. If you have raw mechanical skill in Overwatch, you'll likely have little trouble quickly ranking high in the competitive mode, even if your other skills like positioning, team coordination, and teamwork during intense fights are a little lackluster. You can be the most sullen, toxic, and uncommunicative idiot on the planet, and as long as you can shoot straight, you'll more or less be okay. You'll probably be hated by your team, and maybe if you take it to the extreme, you'll eventually get a slew of player reports sent your way, but you'll probably still do okay in the matches themselves. In Paladins, you just can't pull that off easily. However, for those that actively prefer not to engage in voice chat, Paladins has a very versatile and extensive callout system whereby tapping just a few specific hotkeys will allow you to instantly send out a automatic tactical message in the text chat, with your character also shouting out a accompanying associated voice line. The system includes literally dozens of options appropriate to many in-game situations like group up, flank left, attack up the middle, fall back, etc. Given the simplicity yet effectiveness of it all, you really have no excuse for not communicating. Another important mechanic worth getting a handle on is the in-game card loadout system. Now, one point worth mentioning, I think, is that a lot of Paladins fans tend to argue that these cards are of fundamental importance in shaping how you play, and that's simply not true. Yes, what cards you pick will influence certain active and passive abilities in your kit, and thus will result in some differences, but in most instances, the scale or impact of those differences is, for the average player, far lower than what the game may have you believe. I've tried a number of preset card decks for each character, and have even experimented with creating some decks of my own. And overall, while mastering the art of building decks will definitely help you out in some specific instances, you'll be fine the majority of the time by mainly focusing on familiarizing yourself with your character abilities, rather than obsessing over the character cards. Now, on top of your character card deck, Paladins has a secondary burn card system, where at the start of the match, players are presented with a in-game screen showing a limited preset number of cards. There is no randomization in this deck, and it will appear the same for every player in the game. Personally, I can't say I mind, because the consistency allows players to focus on picking the cards they'll need, as opposed to spending minutes reading the various attributes of every card in the deck. Players can spend in-game currency earned by eliminating enemies, assisting in eliminations made by teammates, standing on or near the objective, etc. The currency cannot be bought in any form and is solely earned through the player's actions in that match. Said currency cannot be carried over between matches. Each burn card has its own specific effect, and once a player purchases a burn card, they can also choose to upgrade it or any of their other burn cards at any time, in addition to acquiring more cards. Players can hold up to 4 cards in a match. Once they hit this limit, the player will then be unable to buy any more cards and will be restricted to only upgrading their existing cards until they are maxed out. I tend to find myself oftentimes fighting either mid-range or up close, so I personally tend to purchase burn cards that allow me to get a set amount of health back per elimination, as well as a second health burn card granting me a life leech ability, where a portion of all damage dealt is earned back as health. But there are a bunch of other useful ones like reload speed increases, movement speed buffs, ultimate ability charge multipliers, etc. Paladins, since its release over 4 years ago, has a total allotment of 22 playable maps, which is a bit disappointing in number compared to other hero shooter games like Team Fortress 2 and Overwatch, both of which have far more maps. And before you go on to say Team Fortress 2 is more or less older than Sin at this point, Team Fortress 2 literally had 37 maps at launch, according to the official Team Fortress 2 wiki page. I suppose the trade-off for focusing on continually outpacing Blizzard in terms of how many heroes they can release in a year, Hi-Rez kind of dropped the ball in terms of ongoing map development. Now, the maps Paladins does have are all really good, with each one feeling different in both art style and design. But to a certain extent, I could also say that about Overwatch and TF2 as well, so I'm not sure whether to give Hi-Rez any bonus points for that specifically. One of the other problems with Paladins, especially when compared with its other aforementioned hero shooter competitors, is how fairly devoid of game modes it is. Aside from Team Deathmatch, Capture Point, and Payload, a fairly minimalistic trifecta of modes, there aren't a whole lot of alternative modes to enjoy. During certain seasonal events, the developers might throw you a bone and add a limited time map or mode to spice things up, but this doesn't really address the problem year-round. It's worth noting Paladins does have a competitive mode, but since its competitive mode merely is a compilation of both Payload and Capture Point into one mode, with a few minor rule changes, I don't really count it as its own distinct mode. One thing I do like about it is that the competitive mode in Paladins, like the one in Overwatch, does not allow you to jump in and play from the start. You'll need to spend several hours playing casual matches before unlocking the option to play competitive, and that seems perfectly fair to me. Competitive should only be for those who actually want to seriously compete against one another. Don't misunderstand me, I don't mean to imply that competitive mode should only be for high-ranking esports league pros, but just that competitive is not the kind of mode where you should be fooling around and not taking things seriously. It's not the kind of game mode where you should be experimenting with heroes or playing with heroes you're not really suited for. Now, a few final points I want to touch on briefly. Firstly, there are a disturbing number of heroes in the game with very similar, almost borderline identical character abilities, voice lines, and movement animations animations that closely align with existing Overwatch heroes. All of these Paladins heroes have been added to the game shortly after or long after their Overwatch counterparts. Now, some might argue that this is a deliberate attempt by Hi-Rez to rip off Blizzard, but I'm not sure I entirely buy that argument, although I'd certainly see where they're coming from on that. Because let's face it, if there's one thing that the video game industry, especially AAA developers, are definitely not opposed to, it's ripping off other popular trending games in order to make a quick buck. Rather, I think the real reason is that both Hi-Rez and Blizzard happen to be developing their respective characters around the same time, and Blizzard, due to their enormous size compared to Hi-Rez, managed to get their heroes out the door first, and Hi-Rez followed suit on their heels. It's possible Hi-Rez tailored the characters slightly to appeal to Overwatch fans, but if they were really intent on wholeheartedly cut and pasting Overwatch heroes into Paladins, believe me, Blizzard's team of lawyers would be on the next plane to a US federal court. Secondly, I've got to talk about the game's monetization approach. Paladins seems intent on following the Warframe mentality by monetizing their games in two very distinct ways. Firstly, players can buy very expensive annual season passes priced at $29.99 USD to gain access to the paid in-game Battle Pass system. And secondly, players can buy a variety of cosmetic items by spending diamonds of premium in-game currency. I'm rather divided on this approach because on one hand I think $29.99 is far too much to spend on any Battle Pass, but at the same time at least it's a pretty transparent means of monetizing your game. Not much trickery behind that. However, the same cannot be said about the in-game diamonds. I don't like the concept of spending money to acquire in-game premium currency that you then spend on premium items. It's a means of psychologically controlling players. It's behavior modification, basically. Studies have confirmed that people are more likely to spend money on in-game microtransactions if they are not using cash or otherwise face the direct cost of their transaction. This is a tactic that the mobile industry has exploited for years now. Diamonds, aside from gold, is one of the most common types of premium currency universally recognized in mobile games. And I'm not overly fond of any AAA game, even a free-to-play game, taking its cues from the mobile game industry in terms of how best to monetize their in-game system. As for my third and probably final point, Paladins seems to have a fair number of optimizational issues and has a tendency to bug out at unpredictable moments. These issues can range from the game crashing on startup, something that happened many times for me, or freezing while on the main menu, to other issues like being stuck on the card selection menu, unable to click on anything or close out the screen and return to the game. It's a little surprising that in over 4 years these issues remain more or less completely unaddressed, since this is not the first time I've had these issues, and from what I've read online, these have been long-standing issues within the game from the community's perspective for years now. Overall, while I think I was right in alluding to Paladins being more or less a knockoff of Team Fortress 2 during its earlier days, and in recent years alluding to Paladins ripping off some popular elements from Overwatch, Paladins really is its own standalone game. The years spent continually improving and refining the entire game has finally paid off. While no one can credit it for being entirely original in regards to the hero shooter genre, Paladins does do more than enough to separate it from its competition and validate its own intrinsic value. And while I strongly frown on how Hi-Rez chooses to monetize the game and question some of their hero similarities to other games, it's not like they're the only publisher to have shady casino-like manipulative practices present in their games, or to have characters that strongly resemble characters found in other games. This is not to say this should ever be excusable, and we should be highly distrustful of Hi-Rez as we would with any other publisher like Activision or EA. But all we can do is continue to be mindful and on the lookout for stuff like this and call it out where necessary. Paladins is available now on Steam, and if you're into games like Team Fortress 2 and Overwatch and you don't mind a little added complexity, Paladins might just be the game for you. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you to those of you that continue to support this channel. We're currently only a few subscribers away from hitting the 675 subscriber milestone. Hopefully we'll have hit it by the time you see this video. So if you want to support this channel and the work I do, consider taking the time to subscribe and click the bell to opt into getting notifications. Odds are you know the drill already, so every ounce of support helps. Let me know what you think of Paladins in the comments down below. I do respond to nearly every comment posted here or anywhere else on the channel, so if you're ever looking to chat or you need to tell me something, leaving a comment is one of the easiest and most effective ways of doing so. Hope you all are having a great, hopefully safe summer, and I'll talk to you all next time. This is WarriorDan signing out. Stay awesome everybody, and peace out.